Okay, simple summary for this week. I want to talk about the American entry into World War One, but I'm going to cover more of that, I think, a little bit in the written lecture. So this is kind of a prequel to that. This is about the war itself, before American entry and how it came along. So probably the best book about the First World War was written by a woman named Barbara Tuchman. It's called The Guns of August. And it's basically this thick, but it's almost like a novel. It's a big, heavy, well-researched history book, but it's like a novel in the sense of how readable it is. If you like history, it's one of the things you can't put down. And it's a couple hundred pages of foolishness, I guess, of the nations of Western Europe, the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, more nations than that. It's a world war. Stumbling into a war that none of them were entirely sure that they wanted. And all of the people who went to war in 1914, when World War I began, or at least a majority of them, had no real idea what they were in for. Because this was the first real war since the Industrial Revolution. And fighting a civil war, say in the 1860s, was terrible, don't get me wrong, right? But the weapons of war were relatively primitive, and so your chances of surviving were better, right? There's no such thing as a machine gun in the Civil War. There's no aircraft bombing you from above. There's no primitive tanks. They're not shooting poison gas at you. I mean, World War I was rough. And the people who, when the war began, were like, oh, we'll be back in a few months, and kissed their sweethearts goodbye, and never came home again. Didn't get a chance to realize or make that comparison because a generation of Europeans was wiped out. The beginning of the war was complicated. It's hard to explain in a short thing, but I'll give you a very quick summary. All of these nations had allies, right? And some of them had quasi-enemies. And so in 1914, there was an assassination of a relatively minor person in Sarajevo, an archduke, a member of the royal family, and that escalated a conflict between minor nations who were unfortunately allied with more important countries. And when the small countries get into a fight and the bigger countries start to get in and take sides, what should be a relatively inconsequential thing turns into a giant mess. There's a word mobilize that's relevant here, which is to get your army and all of your military ready to fight, right? You have them on standby, you have them mobilized. And when this assassination occurred in 1914, it led to a chain of events, a sequence of events where all of the major nations of Europe ended up mobilizing their armies. And that's a hard thing to step down from. When the war machine, so to speak, begins to spin, to turn, to roll, it's hard to stop it. And so, even though the initial violence had nothing to do with the British or the French or the Germans, it turned into a world war. And frankly, Germany kind of exploited this, because once the war started, they said, well, the heck with it. I mean, they planned this. And they invaded France. And they went through Belgium to do it. That was the easy way to get there, geographically. And by violating Belgium's neutral status, that brought the British into the war. And so basically, the big part of World War I in the West was Germany against the British and the French. But Germany was so strong at the time that they could also fight the Russians in the East. And so they had this two-front war, which is, by the way, not something I recommend if you ever want to fight a war. Pick one country to fight, not three. It settled into a stalemate. And basically, both in the Western Front especially, both armies dug themselves into trenches and stayed there. And the land in between just became a no man's land for years. You couldn't, these armies were fighting back and forth, and it was so deadly that you stuck your head up out of the trench and get your head blown off, that the armies didn't really move much, and the losses from all these battles were massive. Like millions of people died in the war overall. So you could lose a couple 100,000 people in one of the big battles. And it really was basically hell on earth, living in those trenches, the bodies stacked up like cordwood because you couldn't get them out. And it's disgusting and muddy, and there's rats, and this is gross, but it's true. The rats are eating the bodies, and it's hard to get food in and out of there, and it's indescribable, the suffering that the armies on both sides went through. And it wasn't much better, really any better, in the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Russians. And the United States was not in this war. The United States, when it began, declared its neutrality and said, well, good luck, fellas. And there are a lot of people who are sympathetic, I think, especially since, we're speaking English right now, sympathetic to the Allies. They are perceived as the good guys, the natural tendency to favor people culturally who are similar to you. But then again, America is made up of people of all kinds, and there's a lot of German Americans. And so basically we wanted to stay out of it. President Wilson tried very hard to keep the United States out of this war. He recognized that it would be a bad thing to just casually enter and have this sort of destruction visited upon the American people. Let me give an example of how bad it was. In the 1920s, 10 years after the war, there were entire grades in England and in France where there weren't any kids, because there weren't enough French men or British men around to become fathers, because they'd all died in the war. There were a lot of women in Britain and in France who never got married because there weren't enough people, there weren't enough living men of their age to marry, because so many people died in the war. So just untold destruction of what was going on in France, and a massive war effort by all of the different countries, and the United States wanted no part of it, and justifiably so. But the problem is that you have to conduct an economy that is international. So we're sending stuff, we're selling things, we're a business too, right? Or at least there are American businesses. And part of fighting a war is preventing your enemy from getting their supplies, especially the British, who live on an island. The way the Germans could win that war would be to starve them into surrendering by sinking all their stuff. And that's eventually how we kind of get dragged into this, or the United States gets dragged into this. But that's sort of a preamble to the war itself in terms of American entry. That's the war before the United States was in, which is the basis of this simple summary. You'll write a summary and answer questions about the American entry into the war as part of the written lecture. But this is the prequel. That's maybe the main event. It depends on how you look at it. But write this up. Don't forget to write the summary. Sometimes people just go right to the questions. The summary is half the assignment. And once again, make sure that you are making it plain that you watched this video and heard me talk today and answered the questions in the same way that makes it clear that you heard this video or watched this video. If it's not plain to me, that's going to negatively impact your grade in a significant way. Okay, that's it for a simple summary, which I think I could say by this point for this week. Bye-bye.